America and its NATO allies are watching developments very closely in eastern Ukraine, where the battle for Bakhmut is raging, and Russia may be on the verge of a much-needed victory. As you can see, Russian troops are inching closer as they try to encircle and capture the city. But Ukraine vows to defend what's left and says it is still in control of a key highway into the area. So how important is Bakhmut? The U.S. Defense Secretary says that it would not be a strategic setback if the Ukrainians decide to reposition west of Bakhmut, arguing that its value is largely symbolic. Meanwhile, in the south, Russian shelling has killed 3 people, including 2 children. That's according to the Ukrainian military. My next guest, retired U.S. Admiral Mike Mullen, spent 4 decades serving his country, and then he served as President Obama's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's joining me now live from Annapolis, Maryland. Admiral Malin, welcome back to the program. So, you know, the word Bakhmut has been on everybody's lips for a long, long time. How do you assess its nature to the prosecution of this war?
Well, I think it's. I basically agree. I don't think strategically, in terms of the progress on the ground, that it's overly significant. But I do think, from both sides, actually, both Ukraine and Russia, that it provides. It's almost symbolic, and it's been 6 or 7 months that the Ukrainians have been fiercely defending Bakhmut, and it's also been obviously that long that the Russians have been attacking it. And one of the things that is just a fact is because of the effort in defense, the Russians have expended a tremendous amount of resources. They've lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. They've lost an enormous amount of equipment. And so whether tactically it's a huge gain or loss on the ground, I think in terms of impact of the war, it's had a significant impact on what Russia can do. And I think it, in its own way, starts to limit what they can do in other places, for instance, in the south, which is a place you just talked about.
So, Admiral Mullen, you just mentioned something that the NATO has just confirmed, at least an official of NATO's actually talking anonymously, saying that they believe Russia has lost perhaps 5 times as many forces on the ground as Ukraine during this battle for Bakhmut. So, you just explained what that might mean for Russia trying to, secure itself in the south. But also, let's just stick with Ukraine for a second, because you've all described it as pretty much kind of a do or die, and certainly symbolic. You remember President Zelensky went to Bakhmut on the eve of his visit to Congress. He brought back a flag that he said a soldier from Bakhmut gave him to take to the United States. So it's hugely symbolic, and they've lost a lot of people. How will that affect the mindset of commanders and troops if they have to then turn around and launch a counteroffensive somewhere else?
Well, I think knowing what they know in terms of the progress of the battle, and it's a city, I think it's some 70,000, and reports are now there are 4,000 or 5,000 left. And also viewing the photographs of the rubble that Bakhmut has become, which I think is what Putin is trying to do across the country, to ruin as much of the country as possible. It will have its effect. That said, those losses that we described earlier with the Russians are typical of their inability to fight. And I think one of the things, to your point about the counteroffensive, when it comes in the spring, we will find the Ukrainian military much more capable of what we call combined arms training, the coordination of air, artillery, armor. They will have much more armor available to them, if you will, in the Bradleys and the Strykers that are over there. And so I think in the long run, it puts Ukraine in a much better position to fight, to continue the fight. And Russia's given me no indication that they are capable of dramatically changing how they fight while they continue to sustain these huge losses. And I think that will happen in the counteroffensive as well.
So, we again heard from the head of the head of the Wagner group, who is Prigozhin, who is complaining bitterly, along with his forces, of a lack of ammunition, a lack of shells and the like. But we also know that Ukraine is lacking that. We know that the EU has earmarked $1 billion for 155mm artillery shells, but they haven't got them yet. And you're talking about this spring offensive, which, to be fair, if spring is March 20th, that's just 3 weeks away. Do you think they're ready for an offensive to start that soon?
Well, I think the question is a great question because, in a way, Christian, this fight has evolved into a battle of attrition. And battles of attrition are oftentimes won by the health or lack thereof of the industrial base. So clearly, both sides are focused on this potential shortage of ammunition. And it's really critical, particularly for the Ukrainians, to be very selective about the use of the munitions that they have, because obviously the supply isn't infinite. But you also hear that Russia's having the same problem. So I think everybody's aware of that and the commitments, as well as creating the production lines, which can be a problem as well, which will produce the munitions for the future fight. And I think everybody would like this to end, immediately. Secondly, there's discussions on how it ends. But my sense, Christian, is this counteroffensive and the results of that for the rest of this year will really set the stage for when this ends. And I actually hope that it's sooner rather than later, sometime late this year.
Yeah, and of course, sooner would benefit the Ukrainians because they are less numerous than the Russians. Putin thinks he can outweight the West, and obviously unity and all of this is being tested, right now. I want to ask you a couple of things, to follow up on what you just said. If you were the commander, the battle zone commander now, what would you say Ukraine needs in order to have a successful counteroffensive? What does it need to focus on, and what equipment, training, sophisticated arms systems does it need now?
The Ukrainians have been exceptional in training throughout this fight over the course of the last year, and actually before that. I would argue that a great deal of the training they did between Crimea in 2014 and 2022 has served them exceptionally well. They continue to train, and this combined arms training, I think, that they are going through now will make a significant difference in the future fight. And that's what I would emphasize. And then back that up, obviously, with the weapons and the systems that they need. Many people are chasing the F-16. It's almost like it's a shiny object. And I think eventually we'll get to F-16s for the Ukrainians. But in the meantime, that's not really what they need. They need the kind of artillery, more HIMARS, more precision-guided munitions to be able to strike deep at the Russians and have the kind of impact they've had in the past. That, to me, will, I think, make a huge difference in what happens over the course of the next 6 or 7 months.
Let me push back a little bit. You say, and many in the NATO group says that that's not what they need when they talk about fighter jets. But the Leopard tank was a shiny object that was being held back for a long time, and now they are getting them, or at least they're trying to get them as fast as they can. And you all are saying that actually they need that kind of projection of power, etc. So why do you think they don't need aircraft? And what we also have heard is that some Ukrainians are being trained outside, including in the United States, on simulators to figure out, exactly how to furnish them with these fighter jets, whatever they might be. Why do you think they don't need them?
I don't think, I didn't mean to say I don't think they don't need them. I think they will eventually get them. You mentioned the training that is being reported right now. What they really need, and they've actually been very good at this, is they need the air defense systems. And if you go back to very early in the war, the number of Russian aircraft that got shot down in the first couple of months was really extraordinary. So the ability to impact, the Russian aircraft as well. And I recognize that at some point in time, we're going to have to go deeper because there are Russian aircraft launching weapons from inside Russia, which is where we don't want to go. And I just think, Christian, that it's going to take a little more time to develop that capability to get them to a point where the F-16s would be handled in an optimum way. I think they're coming, obviously not as fast as both President Zelensky and his military would like.
Yeah, the defense minister did say what you're saying. He does believe that they're coming. And as you say, the question is when. I want to read something that was in the FT recently by, a military analyst. Basically essentially poses the question, does the United States and Europe really want an outright victory for Ukraine? He said, after a year of war, what stands out is less solidarity than the gap between rhetoric and real delivery. A cynic would conclude that the West's unspoken aim is not just to prevent a Russian victory, but to avoid a decisive Ukrainian success for fear of escalation by Vladimir Putin's regime. To me, that looks like old think. Do you, though, think, and you're plugged in around Washington and the defense establishment, is that still, you think, what they might think here?
Well, I think we always have to keep in mind that there's the possibility of escalation, particularly getting to the nuclear threshold. It seems as though that is much less likely than it was even as this conflict started a year ago. I have no information to indicate that kind of think is where we are, that somehow there needs to be some level of equality between these two forces. I mean, I just take the President Biden's visit to Ukraine the other day and how strong he was and how well he's led NATO. And quite frankly, the NATO leadership has been exceptionally strong. And I think it's really important to send a message, quite frankly, that Russia can't do this ever again. And supporting those countries, I mean, Ukraine being one now, but many others who grew up under the Warsaw Pact and under the Soviet empire, if you will, don't want to go back. And that's what this is all about, reassuring that can't happen again.
Exactly. So you have obviously the Baltic states, you have Poland and others, but definitely those who understand the perils of what you've just said. And yet the recently re-elected Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, said, only a few days ago that she is worried that the longer this goes on, the more the unity phrase and the more perhaps there might be some kind of move to, quote unquote, appease Putin. And I just want to know what you think right now, because, at the beginning of this, people like Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, they were talking about trying to get negotiations, trying to talk to Putin, etc. Now, certainly Macron is categoric. This has to end in a victory for Ukraine. How do you assess that?
I think from the leadership standpoint, Christian, that is the answer. And I think leaders have come together to say that. I don't disagree with the view that the longer this goes, the more difficult it becomes. But 6 months ago, we were all talking about whether there'd be a real crack for this spring, and we're there, and we're united. And so, that's why I think what happens this year is hugely critical. Clearly, there are limits, down the road, but I don't want to project, an outcome at this particular point based on what we think might be fissures, in the alliance and in the coalition 6 months or 12 months from now. That's why this year is so important. That's why we need to get as much gear and munitions and support into Ukraine right now so that we don't have to answer that question. It'll be clear that Ukraine has won and Russia has lost.
So that is very interesting to hear you say that, because, again, many say no wars end on the battlefield, they end around a table. Of course, we know that World War II ended with the defeat of the aggressor, the defeat of the Nazis. So I guess you're saying, though, that in this case, Ukraine has to win enough in order to make this a defeat for the other side. Shouldn't be brought to the negotiating table before that. Is that what you're saying?
I think Ukraine has to win enough to be seen as a winner. And I also think, obviously, there are a lot of discussions about how do you craft an end game here. My own view is that obviously, and Bakhmut is a good example. I mean, Putin basically is turning the country into rubble. And that's what he will continue to do. There's going to be a tremendous reconstruction bill that comes due, quite frankly. And I'm hoping that many countries throughout the world will support that, not least of which would be, in my own view, the EU. And, I'm not in that world, but I would see Ukraine into the EU as rapidly as possible, which would do two things. It would underpin an economic recovery long term. And secondly, associated with that would be some kind of security guarantee so that this doesn't happen again. That would also reassure all those other countries who lived under this kind of regime that we weren't going to let that happen.
So I want to broaden a little bit to talk about China, and you as an admiral, you had that whole, that idea, the Pacific and all the rest of it, probably better than many people. What do you make of, and how dangerous do you think, this alliance between China and Russia, even though everybody's saying they've seen no sign of any lethal weaponry going, from China to Russia? But, Russia teaming up with Iran, with North Korea, with China. I mean, if we wanted to coin another phrase, we could again say, I don't know, do you think it's like an axis of evil?
Well, I'm not going to jump on that phrase, but I certainly, and this was many years ago. This was probably 2 decades ago for me, as someone pointed out. I think this was China and North Korea, and we had some hopes that somehow China would walk away a little bit from North Korea. And someone pointed out to me, there are not many communist regimes left, and none of them, and China's not going to walk from any of them. To me, that says a lot about this relationship, which historically had been very fraught, but now I think is very solid and significantly getting better. I'm also struck by the fact that we should remember that when Xi Jinping took over in 2012, his first out-of-country visit was to Russia. And so it's been pretty consistent since that time. I think the idea of China providing lethal weapons is a huge step in the wrong direction for China. It's really dangerous. And there's enough discussion of it right now to certainly indicate that there's intelligence where that is being discussed as a possibility. And I think that would be a huge mistake for Xi Jinping. That said, I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are going to be together for a while at the end, and how all this works in the long term is certainly an open and very serious question.
Yes.
And it extends very quickly to stability in the Pacific region, particularly with respect to Taiwan, another country, another entity, if you will, that is looking more and more to be democratic. And that's a very, I don't think Xi Jinping wants to go to war over Taiwan, but I do think if he thinks he's going to lose Taiwan, he will.
That's what I was going to ask you. So you answered that question. It's really interesting because, of course, you have these two big powers, Russia and China, arrayed against the United States. And we will dig deeper into that with our next guest. Admiral Mike Malin, thank you very, very much for joining us.
This week on the Axe Files with David Axelrod, former GOP rep Peter Meyer of Michigan.
Are you considering running for that Senate seat?
I'm certainly not removing anything from the equation. I care about policy. So much of the way that our government functionally operates, even when it wants to be able to do something and to accomplish something, it cannot get out of its own way.
Listen to the Axe Files with David Axelrod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast app.
As we discussed, China and its support of Russia does make it a key player. But over the weekend, the European Commission President and the German Chancellor both played down fears that Beijing would supply lethal weapons to Moscow. Ursula von der Leyen says she sees, quote, no evidence of that yet. To be fair, the United States is saying the same thing. Chancellor Olaf Scholz indicates he has received actual assurances from China that there will be no arms deliveries. Meantime, Washington and Beijing's relationship worsens. The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken's cancelled trip to Beijing because of the spy balloon crisis is Exhibit A. Author Jing Zhu says the West fails to understand China. Her new book, The Kingdom of Characters, looks at how Chinese history can be defined by its language. And Jingsu is here in New York, and she's joining me now live. Welcome to the program. Look, it is a conundrum. China is a mystery for all of those who've sought to try to understand her for thousands of years. But I want to pick up, Jingsu, on something you said recently. You said, the days of armchair scholarship are over if you are studying China. What do you mean by that?
Well, certainly for myself, having started in literary studies and history, it's become impossible to just read old editions of history and literature to try to understand the pace and the degree of transformation that China is heading towards at this moment. So I found myself having to attend different workshops and poke my head into different conversations to understand the larger picture, right, combined with a kind of historical understanding of Chinese culture and what it's trying to do in the world.
So what did you discover? And as we said, you have looked at it not from just another, academics, military, political, viewpoint, but from this viewpoint of culture and especially language, the kingdom of characters. What did you discover?
Well, what's interesting is that China has been studying the West far longer than it has studied China in turn. And one of the findings of this book is how the degree of determination that China had to face and its people, how its people actually was galvanized behind this effort. So if you're from the perspective of Chinese language, it had to jump through several hoops in order to get itself on par with the alphabetic age, which by far dominates the technology that we deem as the most critical today. For instance, global communications, from telegraphs to typewriters. How do you send Chinese in a telegram using Morse code? Or how do you type Chinese on a keyboard that's labeled by alphabetic letters like QWERTY? And more importantly, how do you get it into the computer age to get Chinese into the machine? So each of these critical choking points showed how China was able to, not just the state, but how much the people were galvanized behind it, how failure in the history of Chinese nationalism, and I think in the long history of the 2 centuries of dealing with the West, failure is not something that the Chinese shy from, that they see it very much as experiences to learn from, which is, I think, something overlooked these days.
Okay, so that's interesting. Let me first ask you about some of these reformers who you detail in the book. One was, I think, a monk, but people who saw the need to modernize the language. Tell me about some of the stories you discovered.
Well, this is really a people's revolution, not in the sense of what the Communist Party would term as people, but really the second and third stringers of history, as I like to think of them. There was the Mandarin, a classic Confucian, who had disguised himself as a monk to sneak through the borders back to China because he felt passionate about saving the Chinese language. He had an idea for it. There was a librarian on the eve of this Japanese invasion of China in the 1930s, who in the process of evacuating did not forget to bring thousands of books with him because it did not want the Chinese written heritage to go to waste or be destroyed by the enemy. There's also these computer scientists who were imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution, who in his cell came up with a scheme and a plan to encode Chinese in the computer. All these individuals operate within very tumultuous environments and not where Chinese state was even in a very strong position. But nonetheless, each of these, I think, individual efforts, like what the Chinese people did, enabled the state to later, in some ways, take the credit for it and to implement it on a global scale.
So a moment ago, you talked about experiments with nationalism and some failures, and that failures were looked at as learning moments. And that got me thinking, because Xi Jinping has become a much more nationalistic and security-obsessed leader than, for instance, economically obsessed like his predecessors. It's bringing back this idea of nationalism with a vengeance. Why, historically, do you think that's happening now?
I think one of the very consistent threads that we see throughout the 19th century, I think since Chinese nationalism gathered steam in the early 20th century, is a kind of anti-Western experience, that they feel that they've learned and suffered and somehow got short-ended they were put at the receiving end of all these international global powers. And so the idea of coming into its own was always cast in the mentality of the underdog, even though we think of China as one of the great superpowers now. So I think that's very much ingrained, I think, in President Xi Jinping's way of thinking when he came to power. You can see a kind of distinct rollback of a kind of opening up of market reform that we saw in the 1980s. In fact, the generation that grew up during the opening reform era, I think is experiencing the current moment with a fair degree of shock and also, I think, disillusionment. So I think it's really important to think of that as we think of Cold War 2.0 at the moment, and bringing back a kind of 1950, 1960 mentality, there's also a generation that's actually wondering what's going to happen in the 21st century, not just a 2.0 version of the 1960s.
So, I mean, again, whenever one thinks of China, we know that their thinking just spans and spreads so much deeper and wider than many in the West, as you just put it. You know, they're already thinking of the next century. But you know, you also said that these narratives develop, and I'm mindful of the fact that President Putin has developed a narrative of being disrespected, or, you know, the former Soviet Union, today's Russia, disrespected relatively by the West, the sort of victim narrative, the false narrative that the Ukraine war is based on, you know, NATO's dangerous expansion that would threaten Russia. And I'm wondering whether you see that kind of narrative forming in China today, as whether they believe it or as a reason for getting stronger and stronger and more nationalistic.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I think since the last administration under Trump, that there's reason for many Chinese to become disillusioned of the Western model that has so aspired to emulate in the early 1980s. And certainly the victimization narrative always has a very ineluctable presence in the Chinese mind. However, in Chinese nationalist history, the idea of victimhood was not abject and disempowering. It was actually a way of galvanizing, inspiring themselves and aspiring to be better, to be stronger, but always cast in the sense that in the road that they would be better, that they would be better leaders than the West once they do come into power. So I think that kind of narrative is very powerful, right? If you are speaking from the perspective of the underdog, it's much more useful than a victor's narrative where you've only enjoyed prosperity and positivity, which I think is kind of a story of the West by this point.
So then what do you think China actually wants? Does it want to rival and surpass the only superpower that's left right now? Does it want to equal it? You know, China is plugged in wherever we look. I mean, it controls in certain ways, such huge swaths of Africa. It's present in Latin America. It's present literally all over the place. It's got the Belt and Road scheme. It's very, very ingrained in so much of the rest of the world. What does China want?
Stability, domestic political stability, economic growth. And I would say, let me put it this way. It's a very easy way of understanding how China's worldview may be different from the United States, just geographically speaking. China borders 14 countries and 6 by sea. United States is surrounded by protected by 2 bodies of water, and a neighbor to the north and a neighbor to the south. Now, China has traditionally, long before it had to deal with the West, it had traditionally been very concerned with stability on the frontiers and borders. So Eurasian frontier, I think also partly explains its now close alliance with Russia, is very much part of its experience of how to stabilize its sphere of influence.
And so how should the U.S. deal with China then? Of course, the United States, as you know, President Biden has said, we seek competition but not conflict. We know that NATO, for the first time, has labeled China a challenge, and they're concerned about the whole sort of strategic balance as they try to, you know, figure out what to do with Russia, etc. What should the United States do? It's true that President Biden has kept some of the more hard-line policies that President Trump came up with, you know, trade problems and protectionists and things like that. What should they do?
I think, first of all, there needs to be more conversation. I think diplomacy has all but fell out of the picture. It is very important to put human back into the loop. And as we see from the spy balloon incident, the speed and pace at which it is spun into an international or diplomatic incident shows that there's not enough conversations and channels for talking through things to slow down the reaction time, because there's a difference between escalating threat or perceived tension and responding to anticipated threat. And I hope that we can build on the latter.
So, look, I assume then you think it was, not the best thing in the world to do for the Secretary of State to cancel his trip. But, when the spy balloon thing was going on, we were told that when Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin tried to contact his Chinese opposite number, the defense minister there, he was unavailable. So they apparently they don't want to talk either.
Well, I'm not sure if we don't have all the information on that one, but I would say that this is an example of how we also overestimate when we think about how China has its finger in every pie. It's a highly controlled, centralized state. There's also a lot of problems within. The communication is not great. In fact, now we're in the third day or so of the National People's Congress. We know that one of the challenges is to trim down bureaucracy, to streamline. So China has considerable headwind at home, and I think that's something that we forget, even though the United States as well has lots of problems at home to deal with. But when we look at our adversary, we look at our nemesis, we tend to project our greatest fear and to make them into something that's more invisible than we are.
Do you think that the United States and China are on a collision course over Taiwan? You just mentioned what's very significant to the Chinese is, among other things, the economy, but it's projected to be less robust than they thought, while at the same time they have announced a much bigger defense budget than they had in the past. You just heard maybe Admiral Mullen saying, he doesn't think Xi Jinping wants a war over that, but if he thinks he has to and that Taiwan is threatened, in his view, that he might do.
Actually, as for the defense budget, 7.2%, I think there's a difference between nominal and real terms. So it actually comes up, if both targets are hit in terms of GDP and CDI, I think it actually comes up to about the same, matches the growth of the economy. Okay. But I would say that this is something, again, I would emphasize that we need to put human back in the loop. We need more conversation, that in some ways that this conflict, this rivalry, in some ways we're just settling down, I think, into the true phase of competition. I think there's been an age of disillusionment. We had our phase of it's like a marriage gone bad, and we think we're still in the period of building a case against one another and having acrimonious exchanges. But I think it is not a marriage that can go away. That the two sides will have to find some common ground, and of course that would not preempt competition.
So I don't know whether this is, he would say that, wouldn't he? But the outgoing Premier, Li Keqiang, said on Sunday at this Congress, we should persist in implementing our party's overall policy on the new era of resolving the Taiwan question, firmly adhere to the One China principle in the 1992 consensus, and firmly take resolute steps to oppose Taiwan independence and promote reunification. What's your assessment of that?
I think that Taiwan is a very special case for mainland China, as we know. Considers a renegade government. They've also had a long relationship since 1949, where since 92, as you quoted, that there was a way for them to at least tolerate or work together or have some kind of non-conflict relationship. And it's true that only in recent years has it escalated. And I have to say, from Taiwan's perspective, no matter what happens, if there's a conflict, if there's a war, Taiwan will suffer more than anyone. Mm-hmm. The Washington, D.C. is 8,000 miles away. Beijing is only 1,000 miles away. Mm-hmm. And moreover, I think for Taiwan, it is tough. It is tough to have a big, powerful friend who wants to stick up for you. And I think that's also an issue for, whether it can say no, whether it can mitigate, and whether, that we still have the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, right, which says that the United States will not intervene militarily. We will supply and give them a sort of a strategic ambiguity as the policy that's worked pretty well for a few decades. And I think what all three sides need is time.
Yeah. Okay.